The morning light filtered through the heavy curtains of Thornfield Manor's drawing room, casting long shadows across the Persian carpet where Miss Isabella Fairfax sat with perfect stillness, her hands folded in her lap, her unseeing eyes fixed on a point somewhere beyond the window. She had maintained this pose for precisely 2 hours, as she did every morning, listening to the sounds of the household awakening around her while her family conducted their daily business as if she were merely another piece of furniture. It was a performance she had perfected over 24 months of careful practice. The slight tilt of her head when someone entered the room, the way her fingers would search delicately for objects just beyond her reach, the careful hesitation in her step that spoke of a world navigated by touch and sound alone. Every gesture was calculated, every response rehearsed, every moment of her waking life dedicated to maintaining the illusion that had become her salvation. What Isabella could not have anticipated was the man who now stood in the doorway, watching her with the patient intensity of a naturalist, observing a rare specimen. The Duke of Blackmore had arrived at Thornfield Manor without announcement, and he had been studying her for a full 10 minutes while she remained unaware of his presence, or so she believed. Miss Isabella Fairfax was the daughter of one of England's most prominent banking families, a young woman whose beauty had once made her the toast of London society until a riding accident 2 years ago had supposedly robbed her of her sight. What she concealed beneath her reputation for tragic fragility was a desperate deception, born of necessity. She had feigned blindness to escape an arranged marriage to a man whose cruelty was whispered about in drawing rooms but never spoken aloud, and she had maintained the lie so completely that even her own family believed it to be truth. "Stay with me until the truth can no longer remain hidden." Isabella heard the soft footfall on the carpet before anyone announced the visitor's presence, but she gave no sign of acknowledgement. In her carefully constructed world of darkness, she was not supposed to distinguish between the measured tread of the butler and the confident stride of a gentleman caller. She kept her breathing steady, her expression serene, even as every instinct screamed that something had changed in the room's atmosphere. "Miss Fairfax," came a voice she did not recognize, deep, cultured, with the slight rasp that suggested a man accustomed to command. "I hope you will forgive the intrusion. I am Blackmore, the Duke of Blackmore." Isabella's pulse quickened, though she was careful not to let the reaction show on her face. She had heard whispers about this man, rumors of his intelligence, his wealth, his reputation for seeing through every deception that London society had to offer. He was precisely the sort of man she had been avoiding since her supposed accident, the sort who might look too closely at inconsistencies others chose to ignore. "Your Grace," she said softly, turning her head slightly toward the sound of his voice, but not quite meeting his eyes. "You honor our home with your presence." She heard him move closer, his footsteps deliberate and measured. "I was in the neighborhood and thought to pay my respects. Your father speaks of you often." This was news to Isabella. Her father rarely mentioned her at all these days, treating her blindness as a family tragedy best left unacknowledged. But she maintained her composure, tilting her head in the way she had practiced, attentive but not quite focused, as if listening to sounds only she could hear. "Papa is very kind," she murmured, "though I fear I'm poor company these days. My condition makes social discourse rather difficult." "Does it?" The question was asked with genuine curiosity, as if he were truly interested in her perspective, rather than merely offering polite sympathy. "I have always found that conversation depends more on the quality of one's thoughts than the acuity of one's senses." Isabella felt a flutter of something that might have been pleasure at the compliment, quickly suppressed. She could not afford to be charmed by this man, could not allow herself to forget that he represented everything she was trying to avoid: the scrutiny of society, the expectations of her family, the possibility of exposure. "You are very gracious, Your Grace, but I find that most people prefer to speak around me rather than to me. It is easier for everyone concerned." "How unfortunate for them," he said, and she could hear the smile in his voice. They missed the opportunity to know a most remarkable young woman. The words sent warmth flooding through her chest, followed immediately by a sharp stab of guilt. He was being kind to someone he believed to be afflicted, showing consideration for a woman he thought deserving of pity. If he knew the truth about her deception, his kindness would turn to disgust, his consideration to contempt. "Your grace is too generous," she said, lowering her head as if overcome by emotion. "I fear my circumstances make me unsuitable for the society I once enjoyed." "Unsuitable?" His voice sharpened slightly. "Who has suggested such a thing?" The question caught her off guard. In her experience, men of his station rarely questioned society's judgments about damaged goods, rarely challenged the assumption that a woman with any form of impairment was automatically diminished in value. "No one has said so directly," she admitted. "But it is understood, is it not? A woman who cannot see, cannot navigate society's complexities, cannot fulfill the expectations placed upon her. Such a woman is better left in quiet retirement." "I see." There was something in his tone that made her skin prickle with unease, as if he were filing away her words for future consideration. "And you accept this judgment? You believe yourself diminished by your condition?" Isabella hesitated, caught between the need to maintain her performance and the unexpected desire to answer honestly. "I believe," she said carefully, "that we must all adapt to the circumstances Providence has given us." "Indeed we must." He moved again, and she sensed him settling into the chair across from her. "Tell me, Miss Fairfax, how do you spend your days? Surely you have found ways to occupy your time despite your limitations." The word limitations was spoken with just enough emphasis to make her wonder if it carried a double meaning. But she pushed the thought aside, focusing on maintaining her character. "I read," she said, which was true enough. She had learned to read Braille with surprising speed, finding it a useful skill for maintaining her deception. "I listen to music. I remember the world as it was, the colors, the faces, the beauty I can no longer see." She let a note of wistfulness creep into her voice, drawing on genuine memories of the freedom she had lost when she chose this path. "Sometimes I think memory is both a blessing and a curse." "How so?" "It preserves what we have lost, but it also reminds us constantly of what we can never have again." Alexander, for she found herself thinking of him by his given name, though she had no right to such familiarity, was quiet for a long moment. When he spoke again, his voice was gentler than before. "Perhaps," he said, "the question is not what we have lost, but what we might yet discover. The world has many forms of beauty, Miss Fairfax. Some require sight to appreciate, but others reveal themselves to different senses entirely." Isabella felt tears prick at the corners of her eyes, real tears, born of genuine emotion rather than calculated performance. When had anyone last spoken to her of beauty, of discovery, of possibility? When had anyone suggested that her life might hold promise rather than merely resignation? "You speak as if you have experience with such alternative perspectives," she said. "I have had occasion to observe that human beings are remarkably adaptable creatures. We find ways to thrive in circumstances that would seem impossible, to discover joy in places where others see only limitation." There was something in his voice that suggested personal knowledge, as if he spoke from experience rather than mere observation. Isabella found herself curious about this man who showed such understanding, such lack of the pity or discomfort that usually characterize people's interactions with her supposed condition. "Your Grace," she said impulsively, then stopped herself. She had been about to ask a personal question, to step outside the careful boundaries she had established for her character. "Yes? Forgive me. It is not my place to pry into your affairs." "I give you leave to pry," he said, and she could hear the amusement in his voice. "I find myself curious about what you were going to ask." Isabella hesitated, torn between caution and genuine interest. "I wondered, that is, You speak with such understanding of adaptation, of finding alternative ways to experience the world. I wondered if perhaps you had personal knowledge of such challenges. Perceptive, he murmured, and she heard the rustle of fabric as he shifted in his chair. I have not lost my sight, if that is what you are asking, but I have learned that the world often looks quite different from what we expect, that truth is not always visible to the naked eye. Duh! The word sent a chill down Isabella's spine. Was he speaking generally, or was there a warning hidden in his observation? She forced herself to remain calm, to maintain the serene expression that had become second nature. Truth, she repeated softly. Yes, I suppose that is something one learns to value differently when the world becomes simplified. Simplified. Bill, when you cannot see the elaborate performances that occupy so much of society's attention, you learn to listen for what lies beneath. People reveal themselves quite differently when they believe they are not being observed. It was a dangerous admission, too close to the truth of her own situation. But something about this man's presence, his voice, his unexpected understanding, had loosened her tongue in ways that could prove catastrophic. How fascinating, he said quietly. And what have you learned from these observations? Isabella felt the trap closing around her, felt the weight of his attention like a physical presence in the room. She had said too much, revealed too much of her own perceptiveness, her own ability to analyze and understand the people around her. I have learned, she said carefully, that kindness is rarer than beauty, that honesty is more precious than wealth, and that most people are far more complex than they appear on the surface. Wise observations. And have you applied these lessons to your own circumstances? The question was so direct, so pointed, that Isabella felt her breath catch. I am not certain I understand your meaning, Your Grace. I think you understand perfectly. His voice was soft, but implacable. The question is whether you are prepared to acknowledge that understanding. Before Isabella could respond, she heard footsteps in the corridor, her father's heavy tread, accompanied by the lighter step of her maid. The conversation would have to end, but she sensed that something fundamental had shifted between them, that this man had seen through her performance in ways that could prove dangerous. Your Grace, her father's voice boomed as he entered the room. I trust my daughter has been entertaining you adequately. I fear her condition limits her ability to be a proper hostess. On the contrary, Alexander said, rising from his chair, I have found Miss Fairfax to be the most engaging conversationalist I have encountered in some time. Her insights are illuminating. Isabella felt her father's surprise, his confusion at the idea that anyone might find his damaged daughter interesting. Indeed? Well, that is most kind of you to say. I speak only the truth, Alexander replied. In fact, I wonder if Miss Fairfax might be interested in visiting my estate. I have a remarkable library, including an extensive collection of books in Braille. I think she might find them educational. The invitation hung in the air like a challenge. Isabella felt her pulse racing, her mind spinning through the implications. A visit to his estate would mean extended time in his company, increased scrutiny, greater risk of exposure. It would also mean freedom from the suffocating atmosphere of Thornfield Manor, a chance to experience something beyond the narrow confines of her self-imposed prison. That is very generous, her father said slowly. But I am not certain Isabella is ready for such exertion. Her condition requires careful management, quiet surroundings. Of course, Alexander said smoothly. Perhaps a brief visit then, a day or two with proper chaperonage and medical supervision if necessary. I believe fresh air and new surroundings might be beneficial for her health. Isabella realized that he was maneuvering around her father's objections with the skill of a master strategist, offering solutions before problems could be raised, making the invitation seem both reasonable and necessary. She began, then stopped. What could she say? Refusal would seem ungracious, but acceptance would place her in a situation where maintaining her deception would be far more difficult. "I would be honored to accept your invitation, Your Grace," she said finally, knowing that she had no real choice. "If Papa believes it would be appropriate." "Excellent," Alexander said, and she could hear the satisfaction in his voice. "Shall we say next week? I will send my carriage, and Mrs. Whitmore, my housekeeper, will ensure that all arrangements are made for your comfort." As the details were discussed and arrangements made, Isabella sat in her chair with growing unease. She had the distinct feeling that she had just agreed to something far more dangerous than a simple country visit, that she had walked willingly into a trap whose dimensions she could not yet perceive. But it was too late for second thoughts. The Duke of Blackmore had issued his invitation. Her father had accepted on her behalf, and she would soon find herself under the scrutiny of a man who seemed to see far more than he should. The game had begun in earnest, and Isabella was no longer certain she held the winning hand. Blackmore Castle rose from the Yorkshire moors like something from a Gothic novel, its ancient towers and battlements silhouetted against a sky heavy with storm clouds. As Isabella's carriage wound its way up the long drive, she allowed herself the luxury of looking, really looking, at the magnificent structure that would be her home for the next week. It was a risk, of course. The coachman might glance back and see her face turned toward the window, might notice the way her eyes tracked the movement of deer across the parkland or the flight of birds above the tree line. But she had been careful to choose her moments, to maintain her performance whenever she sensed observation. The carriage drew to a halt before the main entrance, where a small army of servants waited to assist with her arrival. Isabella forced herself to resume her character, allowing her expression to go blank, her posture to become the careful stillness of someone navigating a world without sight. "Miss Fairfax," came Alexander's voice as the carriage door opened. "Welcome to Blackmore." She turned toward the sound, not quite meeting his eyes, and allowed him to help her down from the carriage. His touch was gentle, but sure, his hand steady at her elbow, as he guided her up the stone steps. "It is magnificent," she said softly, tilting her head as if listening to the echo of their footsteps in the vast space. "I can hear the size of it in the way our voices carry." "Can you, indeed?" There was something in his tone that made her wonder if he was testing her, probing for inconsistencies in her performance. "What else can you hear?" Isabella paused, genuinely listening to the sounds around her. "Water," she said after a moment. "A fountain, perhaps? And music. Someone is playing the pianoforte, quite beautifully." "My sister," Alexander said, and she could hear the warmth in his voice. "Lady Margaret. She is eager to meet you." They moved through corridors that Isabella could sense were vast and richly appointed, past rooms whose purposes she could only guess at from the sounds and scents that drifted through open doorways. Alexander kept up a steady commentary, describing the architecture, the artwork, the history of the castle, but Isabella found herself more interested in what he didn't say, the pauses, the hesitations, the way his voice changed when he spoke of certain rooms or memories. "This will be your chamber," he said finally, opening a door that led into what Isabella could immediately sense was a beautiful room. The air carried the scent of fresh flowers and beeswax, and she could hear the soft rustle of silk curtains in the breeze from an open window. "Mrs. Whitmore has prepared everything for your comfort," Alexander continued. "Your maid will be quartered nearby, and there is a bell pulled beside your bed, should you need anything during the night." Isabella moved carefully into the room, her hands extended as if feeling for obstacles, though her eyes were already cataloguing the elegant furnishings, the magnificent view of the moors beyond the windows, the thoughtful touches that spoke of genuine care for her comfort. "Your Grace," she said, turning back toward him with careful precision, "you are very kind. I hope my presence will not be too much of an inconvenience." "On the contrary," Alexander replied, and she could hear him moving closer. "I find myself looking forward to our conversations. It has been some time since I had a guest who sees the world with such clarity." The word clarity was spoken with just enough emphasis to make Isabella's pulse quicken. Was he speaking metaphorically or was there a deeper meaning to his observation? "I fear you may find me poor company," she said. "My condition limits my ability to participate in many activities." "Does it? We shall see." Alexander paused at the door. "Dinner is at 8. I will send someone to escort you down, though I suspect you will navigate the corridors more easily than you pretend." The words hit Isabella like a physical blow. He had spoken them quietly, almost casually, but their meaning was unmistakable. He knew. Somehow, impossibly, he had seen through her deception. "Your Grace," she began, but he was already gone, leaving her alone with the terrible certainty that her carefully constructed world was about to collapse around her. Isabella sank into the nearest chair, her hands trembling as she tried to process what had just happened. How had he known? What had she done to give herself away? She had been so careful, so meticulous in maintaining her performance, yet somehow he had seen through it all. A soft knock at the door interrupted her panicked thoughts. "Come!" she called, forcing her voice to remain steady. "Miss Fairfax?" A young woman entered, her voice bright and cheerful. "I am Lady Margaret, Alexander's sister. I hope you don't mind my calling on you so soon after your arrival." Isabella rose from her chair, turning toward the voice with the careful attention she had perfected. "Lady Margaret, your brother spoke of you. I heard you playing earlier. It was beautiful. How kind of you to say so." Margaret moved closer, and Isabella could sense her studying her with the frank curiosity of youth. "Alexander told me about your condition. I hope you won't think me impertinent, but I have always been curious about how one adapts to such a change." The directness of the question was refreshing after so many months of careful euphemisms and averted gazes. "It is challenging," Isabella said honestly. "One learns to rely on other senses, to find new ways of understanding the world." "How fascinating! And do you find that people treat you differently? I imagine some must be quite awkward about it." Isabella almost smiled at the girl's honesty. "Some are, yes. They either speak too loudly, as if I have lost my hearing as well as my sight, or they avoid speaking to me at all, as if blindness were somehow contagious." "How tiresome for you." "Alexander said you were remarkably intelligent. I can see why he finds you interesting." The comment sent a flutter of something through Isabella's chest. "Your brother is very kind." "Alexander is many things, but kind is not usually the first word people use to describe him," Margaret said with a laugh. "Brilliant, yes, intimidating, certainly, but kind, he reserves that for very few people." Before Isabella could respond to this intriguing observation, another voice interrupted from the doorway. "Margaret, you are monopolizing our guest before she has even had time to settle in." Alexander's voice carried a note of fond exasperation, and Isabella could hear Margaret's unrepentant laughter. "I was merely being welcoming, brother dear. Miss Fairfax and I were having a delightful conversation about the challenges of social interaction." "I am certain you were. However, Miss Fairfax has had a long journey and may wish to rest before dinner." "Of course," Margaret said, moving toward the door. "Miss Fairfax, I do hope we shall have many more opportunities to talk. I find myself quite curious about your perspectives on various matters." When they were alone, Alexander moved closer to where Isabella stood. "I apologize for my sister's enthusiasm. She has been rather isolated here and is eager for feminine company." "She is delightful," Isabella said honestly. "It has been some time since anyone spoke to me with such directness. Margaret has never learned the art of polite dissembling. She says exactly what she thinks, which can be either refreshing or terrifying, depending on one's perspective." "I find it refreshing," Isabella admitted. "There is something to be said for honesty in conversation." "Indeed there is." Alexander's voice was soft, but Isabella could hear the underlying steel. "Perhaps we might have our own honest conversation, Miss Fairfax. After dinner, when we are less likely to be interrupted." The word sent a chill down Isabella's spine. "Of course, Your Grace, though I fear you may find my conversation less illuminating than you hope." "On the contrary," Alexander replied, "I suspect I will find it exactly as illuminating as I expect." At this moment, would you have told the truth? Dinner was an elaborate affair, served in a dining room that Isabella could sense was both vast and intimate, with candlelight that flickered against what she imagined were ancient tapestries and portraits of long-dead ancestors. She was seated to Alexander's right, with Margaret across from her, and the conversation flowed easily among the three of them. Isabella found herself relaxing despite her anxiety, drawn into discussions of literature, music, and philosophy that reminded her of the intellectual stimulation she had missed during her self-imposed isolation. Margaret proved to be as intelligent as she was direct, while Alexander revealed depths of knowledge and insight that went far beyond the typical interests of a duke. "Miss Fairfax," Margaret said during a lull in the conversation, "I hope you won't think me presumptuous, but I have been wondering, do you ever miss the visual arts? Paintings, sculpture, the way light falls across a landscape?" The question caught Isabella off guard, touching on something she had genuinely mourned during her deception. "I do," she said softly. "I find myself remembering particular paintings, trying to hold on to the memory of colors and forms that once brought me such pleasure." "How melancholy," Margaret murmured. "Though I suppose one might argue that memory preserves art in a purer form than sight ever could. When we look at a painting, we are influenced by our mood, the lighting, the company we keep. But memory holds only what truly mattered to us." It was a surprisingly sophisticated observation from someone so young, and Isabella found herself nodding in agreement. "Yes, exactly. Though sometimes I wonder if my memories are changing, becoming more idealized with time." "Perhaps that is not such a terrible thing," Alexander said quietly. "Perhaps idealization is simply another form of truth, the truth of what something meant to us rather than what it merely was." The conversation continued in this philosophical vein, touching on questions of perception, reality, and the nature of truth itself. Isabella found herself speaking more freely than she had in months, drawn out by the intellectual stimulation and the genuine interest of her companions. It was only when the meal was ending that she realized how dangerous this freedom had become. She had been responding too quickly to visual cues, turning her head towards speakers before they had identified themselves, reaching for objects with too much precision. Her performance was slipping, and Alexander was watching every moment of it with those dark, perceptive eyes. "Miss Fairfax," he said as they rose from the table, "would you care to join me in the library? I believe I mentioned my collection of Braille volumes." Isabella's heart hammered against her ribs, but she managed to keep her voice steady. "That would be lovely, Your Grace." Margaret excused herself with a knowing smile that made Isabella wonder exactly how much the girl suspected, leaving her alone with Alexander as he guided her through corridors that seemed to stretch endlessly through the ancient castle. The library, when they reached it, was everything Isabella had imagined and more. Even in her supposed blindness, she could sense the vast scale of the room, could smell the leather and parchment of thousands of volumes, could hear the way their voices echoed in the vaulted space. "It is magnificent," she breathed, and for once her reaction was entirely genuine. "I am glad you appreciate it," Alexander said, guiding her to a chair near what she could sense was a massive fireplace. "Books have always been my greatest passion. There is something about the written word that transcends all other forms of communication." "Yes," Isabella agreed, settling into the chair with careful grace. "Though I confess I miss the visual beauty of a well-designed page, the way typography can enhance meaning." "Do you?" Alexander moved to pour what smelled like brandy from a crystal decanter. "Tell me, what was your favorite book before your accident?" The question seemed innocent enough, but Isabella sensed a trap lurking beneath its surface. "Pride and Prejudice," she said after a moment's hesitation. "I have always admired Miss Austen's wit." "Ah, yes. Published just last year, if I recall correctly. A remarkable work." Alexander settled into the chair across from her, and she could feel his attention like a weight upon her. "Tell me, what did you think of the scene where Elizabeth walks through the mud to Netherfield?" The way Austen describes her appearance, her disregard for social convention. Isabella's mind raced. She had indeed read Pride and Prejudice, but not until after her supposed accident, when she had devoured books in Braille to maintain her deception. If she had truly been blind for 2 years, she could not have read a book published only months ago. That is, I remember it being quite striking, she said carefully, though I confess my memory of specific details has become somewhat unclear since my accident. Has it? Alexander's voice was deceptively mild. How unfortunate. Memory can be such a fragile thing, can it not? Sometimes we remember things that never happened and forget things that were quite real. The words hung in the air between them like an accusation. Isabella felt trapped, caught between the need to maintain her deception and the growing certainty that Alexander had already seen through it completely. "Your Grace," she said quietly, "I sense that you have something particular you wish to discuss with me." "Indeed I do." Alexander set down his brandy glass with deliberate precision. "I wish to discuss the remarkable recovery you experienced this afternoon when you navigated the stairs to your chamber without assistance, despite having never been in this castle before." Isabella's breath caught in her throat. The banister provided guidance and I counted the steps." "Did you? How interesting." "Because I watched you pause at the landing and look directly at the portrait of my great-grandmother before continuing up the stairs. It was quite a remarkable feat for someone who cannot see." The accusation hung between them like a sword waiting to fall. Isabella felt her carefully constructed world crumbling around her, felt 2 years of desperate performance collapsing under the weight of his observation. "I don't know what you think you saw," she began. "I saw a young woman who has been living a lie for 2 years. Alexander interrupted, his voice gentle but implacable. "I saw someone who has sacrificed her freedom, her authentic self, her very identity to escape something she feared more than blindness itself." Isabella felt tears prick at the corners of her eyes. Real tears, born of genuine despair rather than calculated performance. "You don't understand," she whispered, "and you cannot possibly understand what it means to be trapped, to have no choices, no freedom, no hope of escape, except through deception. Can I not?" Alexander rose from his chair and moved to stand before the fireplace, his profile sharp against the flickering flames. "Tell me, Isabella, may I call you Isabella? What were you so desperate to escape that you were willing to live in darkness for 2 years? The use of her given name, spoken with such gentle understanding, broke something inside her. "Marriage," she said simply. "An arranged marriage to a man who would have destroyed me, body and soul. Lord Pemberton." The name fell between them like a stone into still water. Isabella's head snapped up, her eyes meeting his directly for the first time in 2 years before she could stop herself. "How did you—" she began, then caught herself, but it was too late. The damage was done. "How did I know?" Alexander turned back to face her, his dark eyes holding hers with an intensity that made her feel exposed, vulnerable, and strangely free. "Because I have been investigating Lord Pemberton for the better part of a year. Because I know what kind of man he is, what he does to the women unfortunate enough to fall into his power, and because I have been waiting for someone brave enough to stand against him." Isabella stared at him, her mind reeling with the implications of his words. You know about Pemberton? About what he—" "I know that he has left a trail of broken women in his wake, that he uses his title and his wealth to silence those who might speak against him, that he has been seeking a wife young enough and isolated enough to be completely under his control." Alexander's voice was hard with controlled anger. "I know that your supposed blindness has been the only thing protecting you from becoming his next victim." The truth hung between them, stark and undeniable. Isabella felt a mixture of relief and terror. Relief that someone finally knew, finally understood, and terror at what this knowledge might mean for her future. "What do you want from me?" she asked quietly. "I want to help you," Alexander said simply. I want to give you the choice you never had, the choice to be free, to be yourself, to live without fear or deception. And in return, I want your help in bringing Pemberton to justice. I want your testimony about what he attempted to do to you, your support in exposing him for what he truly is. Isabella considered his proposal, weighing the risks against the possibility of genuine freedom. And if I refuse, if I choose to maintain my deception and return to my family, then I will say nothing of what I have discovered here. Your secret will remain safe. Alexander moved closer, close enough that she could see the sincerity in his dark eyes. But Isabella, you cannot live this lie forever. Sooner or later, someone else will see what I have seen, and they may not be as understanding as I am. The truth of his words was undeniable. She had been living on borrowed time, and that time was running out. If I help you, she said slowly, what guarantee do I have that you will not simply use me as Pemberton intended to do? Alexander was quiet for a long moment, his gaze searching her face. You have my word, he said finally, and you have this. He moved to his desk and withdrew a folded document, placing it on the small table between them. A marriage contract, he said quietly, between you and me, drawn up by my solicitors and witnessed according to English law. If you choose to help me, if you choose to reclaim your life, you will do so as my wife, with all the legal protections that status provides. Isabella stared at the document as if it were a serpent that might strike. You are proposing marriage? To a woman who has been lying to you, to everyone for 2 years. I am proposing a partnership, Alexander corrected gently. A legal arrangement that would protect you from Pemberton's reach while giving you the freedom to be yourself for the first time in years. And what would you gain from such an arrangement? Alexander smiled, and for the first time since she had known him, the expression reached his eyes. I would gain the companionship of a woman intelligent enough to maintain a complex deception for 2 years, brave enough to sacrifice her freedom rather than submit to cruelty, and honest enough to admit her fears when confronted with truth. The words sent warmth flooding through Isabella's chest, followed immediately by a sharp stab of uncertainty. You speak as if you know me, but everything you have seen has been a performance. Has it? Alexander moved closer, close enough that she could see the gold flecks in his dark eyes. The intelligence you showed in our conversations, the compassion you displayed toward my sister, the courage you demonstrated in maintaining your deception, were these performances as well? Isabella considered his words, thinking of the moments when she had forgotten to act, when her genuine self had emerged despite her careful control. No, she admitted quietly. Those were real. Then I know enough, Alexander said simply. The question is whether you are prepared to know yourself as clearly as I see you. Isabella looked at this man who had seen through her deception, who had offered her protection without demanding submission, who spoke of partnership rather than ownership. She thought of the years of darkness she had endured, the freedom she had sacrificed, the authentic self she had buried beneath layers of careful performance. I accept, she said, her voice steady despite the emotion threatening to overwhelm her. I accept your proposal, your partnership, and your protection, but I have conditions of my own. Alexander's smile widened. I would expect nothing less. What are your terms? If we do this, if we become partners in truth as well as law, then I want honesty between us. No more watching from shadows, no more testing my reactions without my knowledge. We face this challenge together as equals. Agreed. And when this is over, when Pemberton has been dealt with and justice has been served, I want the freedom to choose what comes next. Marriage or separation, partnership or independence, the choice will be mine to make. Agreed. Then let us begin, Isabella said, rising from her chair and moving to the writing desk. Let us see what we can accomplish when we stop hiding from the truth and start embracing it. As she signed her name to the marriage contract, Isabella felt a sense of completion that had nothing to do with legal formalities and everything to do with finally truly choosing her own destiny. For the first time in 2 years, she was no longer blind, not to the world around her and not to the possibilities that lay ahead. The wedding ceremony took place in the castle's ancient chapel, witnessed by Margaret and the estate's chaplain, an elderly man who asked no questions about the unusual circumstances of the union. Isabella wore a gown of ivory silk that had belonged to Alexander's grandmother, and when she walked down the aisle without hesitation, without the careful steps of someone navigating in darkness, it felt like a resurrection. "By the power vested in me by the Church of England," the chaplain intoned, "I now pronounce you husband and wife." Deceive. When Alexander kissed her, it was with the careful restraint of a man who understood that their marriage was as much a strategic alliance as a romantic union. But there was warmth in his touch, promise in the way his hands framed her face, and Isabella felt a flutter of something that might have been hope. "Mrs. Blackwood," he said softly, and the name sounded strange and wonderful on his lips. "Your Grace," she replied, then caught herself. "Alexander, my husband." But their brief moment of celebration was interrupted by the arrival of a rider whose urgent message shattered the peaceful morning like glass. "Your Grace," the man said, dismounting from a horse that was lathered with sweat, "I bring word from London. Lord Pemberton has petitioned the Court of Chancery for guardianship of Miss Isabella Fairfax, claiming that her family has been unable to provide adequate care for her condition." Isabella felt the blood drain from her face. Guardianship? He claims that Miss Fairfax's blindness has rendered her incapable of making rational decisions about her own welfare, that she requires the guidance of someone with the authority to act in her best interests. The messenger's expression was grim. He has produced medical testimony supporting his position and has offered to assume full responsibility for her care and rehabilitation. Alexander's expression darkened. "On what grounds does he claim the right to such guardianship?" "Their previous engagement, Your Grace. He argues that as her intended husband, he has both the moral obligation and the legal standing to protect her from those who might take advantage of her vulnerability." The strategy was brilliant in its simplicity, Isabella realized. By portraying her as mentally incompetent due to her blindness, Pemberton could gain legal control over her person and her property while positioning himself as a benevolent protector rather than a predator. "There is more, Your Grace," the messenger continued. "Lord Pemberton has also suggested that Miss Fairfax may have been abducted by individuals seeking to exploit her condition for their own purposes. He has requested that the authorities investigate any irregular circumstances surrounding her current whereabouts." Isabella sank into the nearest chair, overwhelmed by the scope of the trap that was closing around her. "He knows," she whispered. "Somehow he knows that I am here." "Not necessarily," Alexander said, though his voice was tight with concern. "This could be a general strategy, designed to flush you out regardless of where you might be hiding. But if he discovers that we are married, then he will claim that the marriage is invalid, that you were not competent to consent to the union." Alexander began pacing the length of the chapel, his mind clearly racing through the implications. "He will argue that I took advantage of a vulnerable woman, that the ceremony was conducted under false pretenses." The trap was perfect, Isabella realized. If she maintained her deception about her blindness, Pemberton could use it to have her declared incompetent. If she revealed the truth, he could claim that the marriage was based on fraud, that she had deceived everyone about her condition. "What do we do?" she asked. "We go on the offensive," Alexander replied grimly. "We return to London, reveal the truth about your condition, and present our evidence against Pemberton before he can present his case against us." Return to London. Isabella felt her heart skip a beat. But that is exactly what he wants, to get me back within his reach. It is also the last thing he will expect. He is preparing to fight a woman he believes to be blind and helpless. He is not prepared to face a duchess who has chosen to reclaim her sight and her voice. The plan was audacious, dangerous, and completely insane. It was also, Isabella realized, their only chance of success. As long as she remained hidden at Blackmore, she would be seen as a victim in need of rescue. Only by returning to London society as Alexander's wife could she hope to be taken seriously as an accuser. "There will be risks," Alexander continued. "Pemberton will not simply accept your marriage and withdraw his petition. He will try to discredit you, to claim that you were coerced or manipulated. He may even attempt more direct action." "You mean he might try to kill me?" "I mean he might try. He will not succeed." The quiet confidence in Alexander's voice was reassuring, but Isabella had learned not to underestimate the lengths to which desperate men would go to protect their secrets. "When do we leave?" she asked. "Tomorrow morning. Tonight we prepare. You will need to practice being sighted again, moving naturally, responding to visual cues, interacting with the world as someone who can see, and we will need to prepare for the social campaign that will be just as important as the legal one." "Social campaign?" "London society will be watching every move we make, analyzing every word we speak, looking for signs that our marriage is not what it appears to be. We must convince them that your recovery of sight is genuine, that our marriage is a love match, that your accusations against Pemberton are motivated by justice rather than revenge." The irony was not lost on her. To expose the truth about Pemberton's crimes, she would have to convince society that her own deception had been the result of trauma rather than calculation. To prove that she was not a victim, she would have to admit that she had been one. "Can we do it?" she asked. "Can we convince them that my recovery is real?" Alexander moved closer, close enough that she could see her reflection in his dark eyes. "That depends," he said softly, "on how good an actress you are willing to become. And you? How will you play the role of the devoted husband whose love has worked a miracle?" "That," Alexander said, reaching out to touch her cheek with gentle fingers, "will require no acting at all." The confession sent warmth flooding through Isabella's chest, followed immediately by a sharp stab of fear. If Alexander's feelings for her were real, if this marriage was more than a strategic alliance, then the stakes were higher than she had imagined. She would not only be risking her own life and freedom, she would be risking the heart of a man who had already sacrificed too much for her sake. "Alexander," she began, but he silenced her with a finger against her lips. "Whatever you are about to say, whatever doubts you are harboring, save them for later. Tonight we prepare for war. Tomorrow we return to London and face our enemies together. And if we fail, then we will fail together, as husband and wife, as partners in truth as well as law." Alexander's smile was fierce and beautiful. "But we will not fail, Isabella. I have been planning this campaign for too long to allow it to end in defeat." As night fell over Blackmore Castle, Isabella found herself in the library with Alexander, learning to be sighted again. It was harder than she had expected. 2 years of careful blindness had created habits that were difficult to break, reflexes that had to be consciously overridden. "Look at me when I speak," Alexander instructed gently. "Not toward my voice, but at my eyes. People will notice if you continue to navigate by sound alone." Isabella forced herself to meet his gaze directly, to hold eye contact in a way that felt both natural and terrifying. "Like this? Better. Now when you enter a room, let your eyes sweep the space naturally. Take in the details, the people, the layout. You have been starved of visual information for 2 years. Show that hunger, that joy in seeing again." They practiced for hours, working through scenarios they might encounter in London society, rehearsing responses to questions about her recovery, her marriage, her accusations against Pemberton. By dawn, Isabella felt more confident in her ability to convince others that her sight had returned, but she was also acutely aware of how much depended on their performance. "There's one more thing," Alexander said, as their carriage rolled through the gates of Blackmore for what might be the last time. "When we reach London, when we begin this campaign in earnest, There will be moments when the pressure becomes overwhelming, when the temptation to retreat into blindness becomes strong. You must resist that urge, Isabella. You must trust in your own strength, your own worth, your own right to stand in the light. Isabella looked out the carriage window at the Yorkshire countryside rolling past, at the world she had denied herself for 2 years in service to a lie that had become a prison. "I understand," she said quietly. "No more hiding, no more pretending to be less than I am." "No more blindness," Alexander agreed, "in any sense of the word." As their carriage rolled toward London, toward the confrontation that would determine their fate, Isabella felt a mixture of fear and anticipation that was almost overwhelming. She was returning to the city of her birth as a different person, not the frightened girl who had chosen blindness over submission, but a woman who had reclaimed her sight and was prepared to fight for her freedom. The game was about to begin in earnest, and the stakes could not be higher. Their return to London created exactly the sensation Alexander had predicted. News of Isabella's miraculous recovery and sudden marriage spread through the city like wildfire, dominating conversation in every drawing room and coffee house. The story that emerged was a romantic one, the mysterious duke who had fallen in love with a blind woman, whose devotion had somehow restored her sight, whose marriage had been a celebration of love's triumph over adversity. It was, Isabella reflected as she read the newspaper accounts over breakfast in their townhouse, a much more palatable narrative than the truth. Society preferred miracle stories to tales of deliberate deception, and they were eager to embrace the romance while ignoring the darker implications of her years of blindness. "The Lord Chancellor has agreed to hear our petition this afternoon," Alexander announced, setting down his own newspaper with satisfaction. "Your recovery has given us the standing we need to challenge Pemberton's guardianship claim, but it has also made us targets." "What do you mean?" "Pemberton called on me this morning while you were still sleeping. He was most insistent that I allow him to examine you personally, to verify the authenticity of your recovery." Isabella felt a chill run down her spine. "What did you tell him?" "I told him that my wife was indisposed, and that any medical examination would be conducted by physicians of our choosing, not his." Alexander's smile was cold. He was not pleased. "I imagine not. Did he threaten you?" "Not directly, but he made it clear that he considers your recovery suspiciously convenient, that he believes you may have been coached in your responses. He has also suggested that I may have used unnatural means to restore your sight." The accusation was clever, Isabella realized. By casting Alexander as someone who had used dark arts or foreign medicine to cure her blindness, Pemberton could discredit both of them while positioning himself as the voice of reason and traditional values. "What about the guardianship petition?" "Has been temporarily suspended pending investigation into your recovery. The court wants to examine you personally to determine whether you are indeed competent to make your own decisions." A knock at the door interrupted their conversation. Alexander answered it personally, accepting a sealed note from a footman. His expression darkened as he read the contents. "What is it?" Isabella asked. "An invitation to a private meeting. Pemberton wishes to discuss terms for your return to his care." "Terms?" "He is prepared to withdraw his guardianship petition in exchange for an annulment of our marriage. He claims that your recovery, while miraculous, does not erase the trauma you suffered during your years of blindness, and that you require the care of someone who understands your special needs." Isabella laughed, but there was no humor in the sound. "Special needs? He has produced testimony from several physicians who will swear that sudden recovery from blindness often results in mental instability, that you are not competent to make major decisions about your future." Alexander crumpled the note in his fist. "He is prepared to have you declared mentally unfit if necessary." The trap was closing around them with inexorable precision. Pemberton had anticipated every move, prepared for every contingency. If he could not reclaim her through guardianship, he would use medical authority to have her declared incompetent. "There is something else," Alexander said quietly. The note mentions that he has evidence of your deception, proof that your blindness was feigned from the beginning. If I do not agree to his terms, he will present this evidence to the authorities and demand that both of us be arrested for fraud. How could he have such evidence? I suspect he has been watching you longer than we realized, perhaps even before your supposed accident. If he can prove that your blindness was deliberate, that our marriage was based on deception, Isabella felt the walls closing in around her once again. We would both be ruined, worse than ruined. Fraud of this magnitude could result in transportation or imprisonment. Alexander moved to stand before the fireplace, his profile sharp against the flickering flames. But there is one thing Pemberton has not considered, which is that we might refuse to play his game at all. What if we present our evidence publicly, before he can present his? What if we force him to respond to our accusations, rather than allowing him to make accusations against us? Nudihum. The idea was audacious, dangerous, and completely contrary to every rule of social engagement that governed London society. Ladies did not make public accusations against gentlemen. Wives did not air their private grievances in the press. Dukes did not engage in public warfare with their social equals. It would cause a scandal, Isabella said. It would cause a revolution, Alexander replied. But it would also force the truth into the open, where it cannot be hidden or manipulated. And if we are wrong, if our evidence is not as strong as we believe, then we will face the consequences together. But if we are right, if we can prove that Pemberton is the predator we know him to be, then his accusations against us will be seen for what they are, the desperate lies of a man trying to escape justice. Isabella considered the choice before them. They could accept Pemberton's terms, could allow their marriage to be annulled, and her freedom to be sacrificed in exchange for their safety. Or they could risk everything on a single desperate gamble that would either vindicate them completely or destroy them utterly. How would we do it? She asked. The Times has agreed to publish a full account of our investigation, including your testimony about Pemberton's attempted coercion and the evidence we have gathered about his treatment of other women. The story will appear in tomorrow morning's edition before Pemberton can respond. He will deny everything. Of course he will, but denial is not proof, and we have witnesses who will be difficult to discredit. Alexander turned to face her directly. The question is whether you are prepared to become a public figure, to have your story discussed in every newspaper in England. I stopped being a private person the moment I chose blindness over submission, Isabella said. If we are to do this, if we are to expose the truth, then let us do it completely. No half measures, no careful diplomacy. Let us tell the world exactly what this man is, and let justice take its course. Alexander smiled, and she saw in his expression the same fierce determination that had driven him to see through her deception. Then let us write our story, my dear wife, and let history judge whether we chose correctly. They spent the afternoon crafting their public statement, a carefully worded account that laid out Pemberton's pattern of predatory behavior while explaining Isabella's desperate deception as the act of a woman with no other recourse. The tone was measured, factual, and devastating in its implications. There, Alexander said as he signed the final document. Tomorrow morning, London will wake to find that their understanding of recent events has been revised. And tonight we attend Lady Pemberton's ball as planned. We smile, we dance, we play the role of the happy newlyweds while our enemy makes his final preparations. Tomorrow we discover whether truth is indeed more powerful than deception. Lady Pemberton's ball was the event of the season, attended by the cream of London society. Isabella wore the sapphire necklace that had been Alexander's wedding gift, and she moved through the crowd with the confidence of a woman who had nothing to hide and nothing to fear. The whispers followed her, of course, speculation about her miraculous recovery, her sudden marriage, her transformation from tragic invalid to radiant duchess. "Your Grace," a familiar voice said behind her, and she turned to find Lord Pemberton approaching with a smile that never reached his eyes. "How wonderful to see you again. Your recovery is nothing short of miraculous." Lord Pemberton," she replied with perfect courtesy, meeting his gaze directly for the first time in 2 years. "How kind of you to say so. I confess myself amazed by your transformation. The last time we spoke, you seemed quite resigned to your condition. What brought about this remarkable change?" The question was loaded with implications, designed to probe for inconsistencies in her story, while reminding the listening crowd of her previous helplessness. "Love," Isabella said simply, allowing her eyes to find Alexander across the room. "Love and the determination to see the world clearly again." "How romantic," Pemberton said, though his tone suggested anything but romance. "Though I must confess, as someone who cared deeply for your welfare during your difficulties, I find myself concerned about the suddenness of your recovery. Such dramatic changes can sometimes indicate underlying instabilities." The threat was delicately veiled, but unmistakable. He was suggesting, in front of London's most influential gossips, that her recovery might be a sign of mental illness rather than genuine healing. "On the contrary," Alexander said, appearing at Isabella's side with the silent grace that marked all his movements. "My wife's recovery has been gradual and carefully monitored by the finest physicians in London. They have pronounced her completely healthy in both body and mind." "How fortunate," Pemberton replied, his pale eyes glittering with malice. "Though I understand that sudden restoration of sight can sometimes result in confusion. The mind struggles to process visual information after years of darkness. Hallucinations, false memories, difficulty distinguishing between reality and imagination, all quite common, I'm told." Isabella felt the crowd's attention focus on them with laser intensity. Pemberton was systematically undermining her credibility, planting seeds of doubt about her mental state that would grow into full-blown suspicion if left unchallenged. "How interesting that you should know so much about the effects of recovered sight," she said clearly, her voice carrying across the immediate area. "One might wonder where you acquired such specialized knowledge." "Merely the concern of a friend," Pemberton said smoothly. "I have consulted extensively with medical experts about your condition, hoping to find some way to help during your years of suffering." "How thoughtful of you to take such interest in my welfare," Isabella replied, "particularly given that our engagement was terminated so definitively after my accident. Most gentlemen would have considered their obligations fulfilled at that point." A murmur rippled through the crowd. The dissolution of their engagement had been handled quietly, with face-saving explanations about Isabella's need for retirement from society. To hear her speak of it so directly was shocking. "I could hardly abandon someone I cared for simply because of illness," Pemberton said, but Isabella could see the tension in his posture, the way his hands clenched at his sides. "Though I confess I was hurt by your family's decision to end our understanding without consultation." "Without consultation?" Isabella's voice sharpened. "I was under the impression that you were the one who suggested that a blind wife would be unsuitable for a man of your position." The accusation hung in the air like a gauntlet thrown down. Pemberton's face flushed with anger, and Isabella could see him struggling to maintain his composure in front of the fascinated crowd. "I think there may be some confusion about the circumstances," he began. "There is no confusion," Isabella interrupted, her voice carrying clearly across the now silent ballroom. "I remember quite clearly the conversation in which you explained that a woman who could not see would be unable to fulfill her duties as a wife. That blindness was incompatible with the intimate aspects of marriage." Gasps echoed through the crowd. Such frank discussion of marital intimacy was scandalous enough, but to suggest that a gentleman had rejected a woman because of her disability was social suicide. "Miss Fairfax, Your Grace, you are clearly distressed," Pemberton said desperately. "Perhaps we should continue this conversation in private." "I am not distressed," Isabella said firmly. "I am simply telling the truth. something I was unable to do when I was blind, helpless, and dependent on others for protection. Alexander moved closer to her side, his presence both protective and supportive. "My wife speaks with perfect clarity," he said, his voice carrying a warning that was unmistakable. "Perhaps the confusion lies not in her memory, but in your recollection of events. I will not be lectured about my own actions by a man who swept into our society and stole another man's intended bride." Pemberton snapped, his careful control finally cracking. "Stole?" Isabella's voice was sharp with indignation. "I am not property to be stolen, Lord Pemberton. I am a woman with the right to choose her own husband, her own destiny. If you believed otherwise, then you understood neither me nor the nature of marriage itself." The crowd had grown larger, and Isabella could see other members of society pushing through the press of bodies to witness the extraordinary confrontation. This was no longer a private dispute, it was a public trial, conducted in the most visible forum London society had to offer. "Your Grace," came a new voice, and Isabella turned to see the Duke of Wellington himself approaching through the crowd. "I could not help but overhear this discussion. Perhaps we might continue it in a more private setting." "With respect, Your Grace," Isabella said, "I believe privacy has been the enemy of truth for far too long. If Lord Pemberton has accusations to make about my character or my marriage, let him make them here, where all can judge their merit." Wellington's eyebrows rose at her boldness, but she could see approval in his expression. "Very well. Lord Pemberton, you seem to have concerns about the circumstances of this lady's recovery and marriage. Perhaps you would care to state them plainly?" Pemberton looked around the circle of expectant faces, clearly trapped by the very public nature of the confrontation he had initiated. "I merely suggest that sudden changes in mental state, particularly following trauma, can sometimes result in poor judgment. The Duchess may not be fully competent to make decisions about her own welfare." "Are you suggesting that I am mentally unfit?" Isabella asked directly. "I am suggesting that you may have been influenced by individuals who do not have your best interests at heart." "And what individuals might those be?" Pemberton's gaze shifted to Alexander. "Those who might benefit from access to your family's wealth, your social connections, your vulnerability." The accusation was clear. He was suggesting that Alexander had taken advantage of her disability to gain control of her fortune. It was a serious charge, one that could destroy both their reputations if it gained credence. "I see," Isabella said quietly. "And what evidence do you have for this accusation? The suspicious nature of your recovery, the haste of your marriage, the convenient timing of your transformation." Pemberton was gaining confidence now, sensing that he had found a line of attack that might resonate with the crowd. "One might almost think your blindness was never genuine to begin with." A collective gasp echoed through the ballroom. The suggestion that Isabella had feigned her disability was shocking, scandalous, and, if proven, potentially criminal. "That is a serious accusation," Wellington said gravely. "Do you have proof to support such a claim?" Pemberton smiled, and Isabella felt her heart sink as she recognized the expression of a man who held winning cards. "I have witnesses who observed Miss Fairfax, the Duchess, during her supposed blindness, servants who noticed inconsistencies in her behavior, physicians who questioned the nature of her condition, family members who suspected that all was not as it seemed." The trap was sprung. Isabella saw it now, saw how completely she had been outmaneuvered. Pemberton had been gathering evidence against her for months, perhaps years, waiting for the perfect moment to use it. "These are serious allegations," Wellington said. "If true, they would suggest fraud on a massive scale." "Indeed they would," Pemberton agreed. "And I fear that my former fiancée has been the victim of a conspiracy designed to exploit her family's wealth and position. I call upon this gathering to witness that I am prepared to present evidence of this deception to the proper authorities." The crowd erupted in whispers and speculation. Isabella felt the weight of their judgment, their curiosity, their hunger for scandal. In moments, she would be exposed as a fraud, her marriage would be declared invalid, and she would be at Pemberton's mercy once again. But as she looked around the circle of faces, she realized something that gave her hope. Not everyone was looking at her with suspicion or condemnation. Some, particularly the women, were watching Pemberton with expressions of distrust, as if they sensed something predatory in his eagerness to destroy her. "Lord Pemberton," she said clearly, her voice carrying across the silent ballroom, "before you present your evidence of my supposed deception, perhaps you would care to explain why you are so eager to reclaim a woman you rejected as unsuitable for marriage." The question caught him off guard. That is, I feel responsible for your welfare." "Do you? How interesting. Because I remember quite clearly your explanation that a blind wife would be unable to satisfy your particular needs, that a woman who could not see would be unable to appreciate the full extent of your attentions." The words fell into the silence like stones into still water. Isabella could see understanding dawning on the faces around her, could see the women in the crowd beginning to grasp the implications of what she was suggesting. "You are clearly confused," Pemberton began. "I am not confused," Isabella interrupted. "I remember every word of that conversation, every detail of your explanation about what marriage to you would entail. Shall I share those details with this gathering? Shall I explain exactly what you meant when you said that blindness would make me more compliant?" Pemberton's face went white. "You would not dare. I would dare anything to prevent another woman from suffering what you intended for me." Isabella turned to address the crowd directly. "Ladies and gentlemen, you have heard Lord Pemberton's accusations about my character, my marriage, my supposed deception. But before you judge me, I ask you to consider why a man would be so desperate to reclaim a woman he once rejected. What does he gain from my disgrace? What does he lose from my freedom?" The questions hung in the air, and Isabella could see doubt creeping into the expressions around her. Pemberton's eagerness to destroy her was beginning to look less like concern and more like obsession. "Furthermore," Alexander said, stepping forward with a document in his hand, "I have here sworn testimony from 3 women who were previously engaged to Lord Pemberton. Women who broke their engagements under mysterious circumstances, who withdrew from society rather than proceed with marriages that had been arranged by their families." The crowd stirred with interest. Multiple broken engagements suggested a pattern that went beyond mere incompatibility. "These women have agreed to testify about Lord Pemberton's particular requirements for a wife. Requirements that include absolute obedience, complete isolation from family and friends, and submission to practices that most would consider inappropriate." Pemberton's composure was cracking visibly. "These are lies, fabrications designed to discredit me." "Are they?" Alexander unfolded the document. "Lady Catherine Morrison, formerly engaged to Lord Pemberton in 1811, broke the engagement after he demanded that she dismiss all her female servants and replace them with his own choices. Lady Anne Whitmore, engaged in 1812, ended the engagement when he insisted that she cease all correspondence with her family. Miss Sarah Hartwell, engaged just last year, terminated the engagement when he presented her with a list of intimate requirements that she found disturbing. Each name hit Pemberton like a physical blow. Isabella could see him calculating, trying to determine how much Alexander knew, how much damage these revelations could do to his reputation. "These women," Alexander continued, "have described a pattern of behavior that suggests Lord Pemberton seeks not a wife, but a victim. Someone young, isolated, and completely under his control. Someone like Miss Fairfax was when she was blind and dependent on others for protection." The crowd was murmuring now, the whispers growing louder as people began to piece together the implications of what they were hearing. "Your Grace," Wellington said gravely, "these are serious accusations. Do you have evidence to support them?" And I do, Alexander replied. Written correspondence from Lord Pemberton to these women detailing his expectations for their behavior after marriage. Medical testimony about injuries suffered by his first wife before her untimely death. Financial records showing payments to certain establishments that cater to men with unusual tastes. Isabella watched Pemberton's face cycle through a series of expressions: denial, calculation, and finally, a cold rage that made her step closer to Alexander's side. Even if what you claim were true, Pemberton said slowly, it does not change the fact that this woman has perpetrated a fraud upon society. She has feigned blindness, deceived her family, and entered into a marriage based on lies. Has she? Alexander smiled, and Isabella saw in his expression the satisfaction of a man who had been waiting for exactly this moment. Or has she simply protected herself from a predator using the only means available to her? He reached into his coat and withdrew another document. I have here a statement from Dr. Morrison, the physician who treated Miss Fairfax after her riding accident 2 years ago. According to his records, her injuries were consistent with a deliberate assault rather than an accident. Someone struck her repeatedly about the head and face, causing trauma that could indeed have resulted in temporary blindness. The revelation sent shockwaves through the crowd. Isabella felt her knees weaken as the truth of that terrible day came flooding back. Not the riding accident she had claimed, but the brutal attack that had occurred when she had tried to break her engagement to Pemberton privately. Furthermore, Alexander continued, Dr. Morrison notes that Miss Fairfax's recovery of sight began almost immediately, but that she chose to conceal this improvement out of fear for her safety. In his medical opinion, her deception was not fraud, but self-preservation. That is impossible, Pemberton snarled. Morrison would never. Dr. Morrison is prepared to testify under oath about his findings, Alexander said calmly, as are the servants who witnessed your visit to Miss Fairfax on the day of her supposed accident, servants who saw you leave her room in a state of considerable agitation, who found her unconscious and bleeding shortly thereafter. The trap was closing around Pemberton now, and Isabella could see him beginning to panic. These are lies, all of them. Fabrications designed to protect a woman who has made fools of us all. Then you will welcome an official investigation, Wellington said firmly. If these accusations are false, if this evidence is fabricated, then a proper inquiry will clear your name and expose the truth. Of course, Pemberton said quickly, but Isabella could hear the desperation in his voice. I have nothing to hide, nothing to fear from honest investigation. Excellent, Alexander said, because I have already petitioned the Lord Chancellor to open such an investigation. The hearing will take place tomorrow morning, and all parties will have the opportunity to present their evidence. The crowd was buzzing with excitement now. This was no longer a simple social scandal. This was a public accusation of assault, fraud, and conspiracy that would be decided in the highest courts of the land. Your Grace, Pemberton said, turning to Wellington with one last desperate gambit, surely you cannot give credence to accusations made by a woman who has admitted to deceiving everyone for 2 years. How can we trust the word of someone who has proven herself capable of such elaborate deception? It was a good point, Isabella realized. Her own admission of fraud had undermined her credibility as a witness, making it easier to dismiss her accusations as the lies of a desperate woman. But Wellington's response surprised her. Lord Pemberton, he said quietly, I have known many soldiers who have used deception to survive in hostile territory. I have never condemned a man for lying to his enemies, and I will not condemn a woman for lying to hers. The question is not whether the Duchess deceived you. The question is why she felt deception was necessary. The words hit Pemberton like a physical blow. Wellington's support carried enormous weight in London society, and his interpretation of Isabella's actions as survival rather than fraud would influence how others viewed the situation. Furthermore, Wellington continued, I find myself curious about your own actions during the Duchess's supposed blindness. If you truly cared for her welfare, why did you not visit her? Why did you not offer support to her family during their time of trial? Your sudden interest in her fate seems to have emerged only after her recovery and marriage. Pemberton opened his mouth to respond, then closed it again. There was no good answer to Wellington's questions, no explanation that would not make him look either callous or predatory. "I think," Wellington said finally, "that we have heard enough for one evening. Tomorrow's hearing will determine the truth of these matters. Until then, I suggest we all reserve judgment." As the crowd began to disperse, buzzing with excitement and speculation, Isabella felt a mixture of relief and terror. They had survived the first battle, had managed to turn Pemberton's accusations back on him, but the war was far from over, and tomorrow would bring the real test of their evidence, their strategy, and their courage. "It is done," Alexander said quietly, as they made their way toward the exit. "Yes," Isabella replied. "For better or worse, it is done. Do you regret it? The public nature of our accusations?" Isabella considered the question as they stepped out into the cool night air. "No," she said finally. "Secrets thrive in darkness, but truth flourishes in the light. If we are to expose this man for what he is, if we are to protect other women from his predations, then it must be done openly, where all can see and judge for themselves. And if we have made an enemy tonight, then we have also made allies. Wellington's support alone is worth 12 enemies." Isabella took Alexander's arm as they walked toward their carriage. "Besides, we were already Pemberton's enemies. At least now the battle lines are clearly drawn." As their carriage rolled through the darkened streets of London, Isabella reflected on how much had changed since her desperate choice to feign blindness 2 years ago. She had begun this journey as a frightened young woman, using deception to escape an unwanted marriage. She was ending it as a duchess who had publicly accused her former fiancé of assault and conspiracy, who had chosen truth over safety, justice over silence. "Whatever happens tomorrow," Alexander said, taking her hand in his, "I want you to know that I am proud of your courage tonight. You could have remained silent, could have allowed others to fight this battle for you. Instead, you chose to stand and speak truth to power." "We chose," Isabella corrected. "We stand together, or we fall together. That was our bargain, and I intend to honor it. Even if it costs us everything? Especially if it costs us everything. Some things are worth any price, Alexander. Honor, justice, the right to live without fear. These are not luxuries to be traded away for safety or convenience." Alexander raised her hand to his lips, pressing a gentle kiss to her knuckles. "I love you," he said simply, "not just for your beauty or your intelligence, but for your courage, your integrity, your refusal to be diminished by circumstances beyond your control." "And I love you," Isabella replied, surprised by how easily the words came, how right they felt, "for seeing me as I truly am, for believing in my strength even when I doubted it myself, for offering me partnership instead of protection." They rode in comfortable silence for a while, each lost in their own thoughts about the challenges that lay ahead. Tomorrow would bring the hearing, the presentation of evidence, the moment of truth that would determine not just their own fates, but the fate of any woman who might fall into Pemberton's power in the future. "Alexander," Isabella said as their carriage turned onto their street, "there is something I need to tell you." "What is it?" When I first accepted your proposal, when I agreed to this marriage, I thought I was making a practical choice, a strategic alliance that would serve both our purposes. I did not expect—" She paused, searching for the right words. "I did not expect to find love in the midst of all this danger and deception. And now I know that whatever happens tomorrow, whatever the hearing decides, whatever consequences we face, I want to face them as your wife, not just in law, but in truth. I want our marriage to be real, Alexander. I want us to be real." Alexander's smile was radiant in the lamplight. We have been real from the moment you chose to trust me with your secret, from the moment you decided to reclaim your sight and your voice. Everything else is just paperwork." As they entered their townhouse, Isabella felt a sense of completion that had nothing to do with legal formalities and everything to do with finally, truly choosing her own destiny. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new dangers, new choices to be made. But tonight, she was exactly where she belonged, beside the man who had seen through her deception to the truth beneath, who had offered her partnership and found love instead. The game was nearly over, and she was no longer afraid of the outcome. The trial of Lord Pemberton had been the sensation of London society, dominating headlines and drawing crowds to the courthouse every day. The evidence that Alexander and Isabella had presented proved even more damning than they had hoped. Medical testimony about suspicious injuries, witness statements from former fiancés, financial records that revealed a pattern of predatory behavior spanning years. Pemberton had been convicted of assault and conspiracy, sentenced to transportation to Australia, his estates confiscated, his titles stripped. The network of accomplices who had helped him silence his victims was exposed and prosecuted, leading to reforms in how such cases were handled by the courts. Isabella had testified with quiet dignity, her words carrying the weight of truth and the authority of someone who had risked everything to expose the crimes she had witnessed. The press had been fascinated by the story of the Duchess, who had feigned blindness to escape a predator, who had reclaimed her sight to seek justice, but she had watched none of the sentencing. By the time justice was finally served, she was already far from London, walking in the gardens of Blackmore Castle with Alexander at her side, planning a future that belonged entirely to them. "The roses are particularly beautiful this year," Alexander said, pausing beside a bush heavy with red blooms. "They are," Isabella agreed, though her attention was focused not on the flowers, but on the letter in her hands, a message from the Queen herself, formally recognizing her courage in exposing Pemberton's crimes and establishing a fund to help other women in similar circumstances. "Any regrets?" Alexander asked, noting her thoughtful expression. Isabella considered the question seriously, thinking of all the pain and fear she had endured, all the moments when she had wondered if she would survive to see another day, all the years of darkness she had chosen rather than submit to cruelty. "No," she said finally. "Every choice led me here to you, to this life we are building together. I cannot regret the path that brought me such happiness. Even the blindness, even the deception, especially the blindness," Isabella replied. "It taught me to see with more than my eyes, to understand that truth is not always visible on the surface. Without those years of darkness, I might never have learned to recognize the light when I found it." Alexander smiled, pulling her closer against his side. "And what of the future? What shall we do with all this peace and prosperity?" "We shall live," Isabella said simply. "We shall love, we shall laugh, we shall help other women find the courage to speak their truth, and perhaps—" She paused, her hand moving instinctively to her still flat stomach. "Perhaps we shall give our children the freedom to see clearly from the very beginning." Alexander's eyes widened as he caught her meaning. "Isabella, are you saying—" "I am saying that our family is about to grow, that our love has created something new and wonderful, that the future holds even more joy than we dared to imagine." Alexander swept her into his arms, spinning her around in a circle of pure happiness while she laughed with delight. When he set her down, his eyes were bright with tears of joy. "A child," he whispered. "Our child." "Our child," Isabella confirmed. "A son or daughter who will grow up free from deception, who will never know what it means to hide in darkness or fear the light. A child who will see the world clearly and choose love over fear, truth over convenience, courage over safety." As the sun began to set over the gardens of Blackmore, over the estate that was now their shared home, over the future that stretched before them bright with possibility, Isabella Blackwood, Duchess of Blackmore, felt a peace she had never known before. She had found her place in the world, not as someone's victim or someone's property, but as a woman who had chosen her own destiny and found it good. The past was behind them, with all its pain and deception. The future stretched ahead, bright with promise and possibility. And in this moment, surrounded by love and safety and the absolute certainty of her own worth, Isabella knew that she had made the right choice. She had chosen truth over lies, courage over fear, light over darkness. She had chosen to see clearly, to speak honestly, to love completely, and she had chosen well. Which choice would you have made? If this tale of deception, courage, and love's triumph over darkness captivated you, please give this video a like and subscribe to our channel for more dramatic historical romances that will leave you breathless. Share your thoughts in the comments below. What would you have done in Isabella's place? Would you have chosen years of blindness over submission to cruelty? Your engagement helps us bring you more stories where love conquers all and justice prevails. Thank you for joining us at Blackmore Castle, and until our next tale unfolds, remember that sometimes we must close our eyes to the world to truly see what matters most.